Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Keri Thomas, and my paper today is entitled Let There Be Light, the Holy Digitised Artefact. Back in 2019, I was giving a paper at the IMC Leeds called From the Divine to the Digital, Digitisation as Resurrection and Reconstruction. My work has always leaned towards the theoretical, and I've long been interested in the reasons why people consider digitised manuscripts to be inferior to the physical artefact when the digitised version is sometimes superior, not just in how it looks, but in what it presents to us. This paper now forms part of Medieval Manuscripts in the Digital Age, published by Routledge in July this year. My flagrant self-promotion is over for now, but I'll focus on some of the content of that paper later on because it's a jumping off point for what I want to talk about here. The chapter discussed why digitisation of a medieval manuscript is nothing more nor less than the bodily resurrection envisaged by scribes who laboured away to present to us the Word of God. The body, so important to medieval theologians, isn't undone by digitisation. In fact, it is enhanced. After I presented the paper at Leeds, I was feeling buoyant enough to stick around for the afternoon session, and that's when I had the great good fortune to see Linley Herbert give her paper on the tarnished reputation of medieval manuscripts. That paper is also being published this year, so you must seek it out if you can. In this paper, she mentioned a particular manuscript, Saint Croix Gospels, Poitiers, MS 17. There's an image within it of Christ in majesty with the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Linley said there were a high number of odd choices made by the original illustrator, in particular the enigmatic colour choices, and that those choices had led to the manuscript being judged as an inferior object. But Linley's hypothesis was that the work was attempting to visually replicate ideas of divinity. The pigment choices, therefore, served as a visual translation of word into image. Now, this really resonated with me, as you can imagine, given the content of my paper. I began to really think about the sorts of things that we see in medieval manuscripts, how God was presented to us on the manuscript page. I was starting to think about different manuscripts that I'd perhaps like to meet in real life and thinking about how I might facilitate those meetings. As we moved into 2020, I thought I had a good while to sort things out. I had a conference in Glasgow that I was hoping to attend and present at, and a paper I was going to discuss at the National Library of Wales here in Aberystwyth in September. However, world events outpaced my admittedly desultory organisational efforts. By the first week of March, we had locked down as a family. I watched, as did you all, I'm sure, with the doors of businesses and cultural institutions closing with a real sense of dread. In that panic, I suddenly understood the desire for digitisation from a slightly different perspective. As a privileged white Westerner growing up within some of the safest decades the human race has ever experienced, I realised that we risked losing access to great swathes of our cultural archive with the closure of those doors. Everything that had been digitised would be accessible online. Everything that had not was suddenly entombed. Disease became, in this instance, the ultimate gatekeeper, the stone rolled across the mouth of the cave. So I felt a kind of alarm. I suddenly saw the benefit of what Rafael Alvarado called the Great Project, the retrieval and remediation of the vast collection of primary sources that have accumulated in our libraries and museums. I felt like I suddenly understood projects like Google Books, which I had previously decried, sympathetic suddenly to Google's perceived humanistic endeavour to make all of the world's knowledge available to everyone. I had this terrible urgency to gather everything up and digitise the world. I obviously wasn't the only one who felt this way. The British Museum posted a statement about their closure and reassured readers that they would be working on adding digital content during the period to allow visitors to stay in touch with the museum. But the problems with mass digitisation obviously haven't gone away, and they aren't lessened under the weight of our fear. Indeed, I've written in the past about the damage done by such digitisation, the recreation of Borges' map under which the real world dies. In an article in the Times in August of this year, journalist Martha Gill suggested that there is nothing you can learn from an artefact that you cannot learn from its digital copy. Academics on Twitter vehemently disagreed. To my mind, one of the main issues with digitisation is that, as Alvarado pointed out last year, the great project has been undone by the overwhelming forces of globalisation. The digital scriptorium has been replaced by a data mining operation. Words are bagged up, vectorized, stripped, texts are assaulted. If a deep dive into a manuscript is undertaken, like the work on the digital Beowulf, for example, then we could potentially treat the digital as on a par with the physical copy, but not all digitization strategies engage with the manuscript on that level. A further problem is that we are wary of what digitization is doing to our understanding of these artifacts, and even what it is doing to our concept of what knowledge is, without addressing those issues within the digital humanities. Adeline Coe's take is that humanities computing has focused on using computational tools to further humanities research and not to study the effects of computation as a humanities question. Digitized manuscripts can and should be amazing things to engage with, and there are a great many things to be gained from digitization. In her chapter, What It Is to be a Digitization Specialist, Astrid J. Smith, the Rare Book and Special Collections Digitization Specialist for Stanford University Libraries' Digital Library Systems and Services, talks about the things that are gained and lost from a practical perspective in the digitization of an object. We gain additional information from descriptive metadata and image copyright or use and reproduction statements. We also gain mystery. As Bill Enders explains, advanced techniques for digital imaging have methods for teasing out insight. These methods labor with numerically captured visual information, making the page receptive to mathematical processing, moving beyond human capacities to unriddle mysteries held in reflected light. What we lose is materiality. We cannot necessarily feel the weight of a manuscript and receive the singular pleasure of handling an object that has come through history, and we often lose context. Aside from the occasional brief description attached to the digitized images of a manuscript, more often than not, the user is left to scroll through an endless array of pages that may mean nothing to them. For academics who can navigate such terrain with more ease, their problems are exacerbated by poor digitization projects, where rather than enlightening, digitization obscures the truth. Indeed, within the big tent, the quality of the acts differs markedly. Not every acrobat we see is Jules Leotard. Bad digitization, particularly in a post-pandemic world where access to physical spaces and physical artifacts is limited for long periods of time, becomes the metaphorical flaming sword, barring access to Eden. I come back to this example time and time again. Andrew Prescott's description of the digitization of Charles Darwin's diaries back in 2006. Priority was given to transcripts of the diaries. What were offered to the keen viewer, hoping to see inside Darwin's notebooks, were poor quality grayscale images taken from microfilm. Prescott did note that treatment differed depending on who is doing the digitizing. With the Darwin Project, historians seem to view the digitized notebooks as a bonus feature and prioritize transcripts of the text instead. And this makes sense, as of course, different people have different requirements when it comes to a digitized artifact. Prescott pointed out that literary scholars dealt with digitization very differently at the time, with emphasis on the visual element over the text. This, however, is often now to the detriment of a digital artifact, where sophisticated, important manuscripts are transformed into a glorified PDF. An example of this was Cotton Tiberius MSB5, or Tiberius as it's colloquially known. Martin Foys wrote a great chapter about it back in 2015. The British Library had not at that point digitized the manuscript fully. What it had digitized were images, amongst them a mappa mundi, the Cotton map, the earliest surviving detailed and non-schematic map, medieval map of the world produced in England. It had prioritized those images above the rest of the manuscript. It reduced a complex manuscript, one that Foys described as a negotiation of temporal forms, to a handful of pictures. In her talk, Books of Ours as Transformative Texts, which she presented at last year's Dark Archive conference, Dot Porter set out the work of the Bibliophily project and the way in which she and her colleagues digitized manuscripts. Images and metadata go on the OPEN website, a minimalist-looking site that was developed specifically for its simplicity. As Porter sees it, data is fairly unchangeable, but its presentation is a separate thing. It can change dramatically. The data is therefore provided as free cultural works, and the interface by which that data is seen can be adapted. as changes in presentation methods occur. That is, to my mind, an excellent way of working and navigates the gulf between the data and its presentation that can occur. When projects like the Bibliophily project show how hard digitisers work to bring the full manuscript to the computer screen, it reinforces Abigail G. Robertson's analysis that much of what scholars do with digitised manuscripts challenges the primary-secondary dichotomy that has come to pass with them. There is simply no reason why the digital should be demoted to a beta status. In fact, digitisation can often find faces in the darkness that we did not know existed. A prime example of this is Mariah Williams's work with the Black Book of Carmarthen, Llyfrau di Caerfyrddin, or NLW NS Penniarth 1. A medieval Welsh manuscript containing religious and secular material. When Williams put it under a UV lamp, she discovered some ghostly faces staring up at her from the folio. Multispectral imaging revealed two people who might either be two men or a man and a woman, with their eyes turned upwards towards one another above the curl of lovely stylized noses. They appear to be clasping each other around the shoulders. With this image, some text is included. Anach a chariad ad fi an harid y visaf gar, which translates as greetings and affection to my most honourable kinsman. I am, alas, a South Walian, so I should interject here and say that my Welsh does not stand up to much scrutiny, but you can find the original text in Mariah's wonderful paper Minding the Gaps, which outlines her analysis of the manuscript. What is particularly pleasing is that the erased image and its accompanying writing are beneath a poem where the poet is seeking to reconcile with his lord. Here then, digital imaging has provided us with an added context to the composition that we simply would not have had. This was a truth that had been lost to us by its erasure from the physical artefact. Where once there was darkness, now there is light. Another example of a digitisation project returning something to us that was lost is that of the Codex Sinaiticus, which Andrew Prescott and Lorna Hughes discuss in their clarion call for slow digitisation, Why Do We Digitise?, published in 2018. With over half the book still in existence, but scattered between the British Library, St. Catherine's Monastery, Leipzig University Library, and the National Library of Russia, the digitisation of this extraordinary artefact, so integral to our understanding of the Christian Bible, has meant the book has been reunited after centuries of separation. The digital manuscript is shown under various lights, showing detail that would not easily be seen in the physical object. There are textual variants that can be magnified and analysed in greater depth. The digital codex is also fully searchable. Truth does not have to be lost if a slow digitisation strategy is employed. A digitisation such as the one undertaken on the Codex enables a significant amount of research to be undertaken. But Codex Sinaiticus is an oddity. As Prescott and Hughes put it, it is not asking for a hit count. In fact, it is the physical printed facsimile of the Codex, bereft of the scholarly tools supplied by the digital facsimile, which lacks rigour. But rarely do digitisation strategies look to research as their primary focus. So I have given what I think is a brief overview of the problems with digitisation as it stands today, problems that you are all, of course, aware of. But I want to dig a bit deeper now into that idea that manuscripts provide something that we may never have physically experienced. The medieval manuscript was created for many purposes, not just to bring light into the darkness through the dissemination of knowledge, but also to create a link to God through the scribal act. In the act of writing, the processes of creation involved in the making of a manuscript and the very existence of a manuscript in the world, we find an act of worship. As I said in my Leeds paper last year, the repetition of the work creating a manuscript creates a kind of meditative state that allows the scribe to become open to God's grace. And manuscripts provide solidity, their very physicality, a way of pronouncing the importance of faith. Look at the Stavelot Bible, 58 by 39 centimetres and weighing in at 40 pounds. You need 4 people to carry both volumes. Or the 470-page Rylance Quran of Cancer al-Ghuri, housed at the University of Manchester. It's 88 by 60 centimetres. My personal favourite is the Codex Gigas, 89 centimetres by 48 centimetres, weighing in at 165 pounds. And it has this enormous picture of the devil on folio 290R, Wouldn't that be enough to terrify you into submitting to the word of God? So the digital lacks physicality, but it is nonetheless a light in the darkness. Baudrillard talks about technology being an extension of the body. He saw this extension as being, on one hand, apocalyptic, the mortal deconstruction of the body and an extension of death. He talks about the dismemberment and cutting into pieces of the body in a way that is highly reminiscent of the way Elaine Trahan talks about the cutting up of manuscripts in Fleshing Out the Text. In Baudrillard's scenario, digitisation of our medieval manuscripts is an explosive vision of a body delivered to symbolic wounds, savage and continual surgery. But as we have seen, often digitisation brings together things that have been separated over time in the physical world. When the Ryland Quran was digitised in 2011, it was reunited with several leaves that had been housed in Dublin and which had hitherto been too fragile for study. So in this scenario, digitisation is more akin to Baudrillard's functionalist approach. Digitisation as a series of relays and extensions that eventually become the organic body of man. We know that medieval scribes would have had an idea of resurrection as being a bodily thing. You could not attain resurrection in the kingdom of heaven if your body was not intact. The body was so important that even the soul became so metamorphic. It was why medieval theologians were seemingly so obsessed by the idea of cannibal babies. Many thanks to Eric Wade for his very enlightening Twitter thread on this subject last year. My suggestion is that the body is a construct, and so too a physical manuscript. Manuscripts and computers are comprised of materials that are imbued with God's grace. And that if Christianity is a religion oriented around things that can mediate a discussion between the mortal and the divine, as Goldwaite puts it, then why can't those things be keyboard and screen, the software and hardware? Thus, the digital delivers us a resurrection that the medieval manuscript can only promise. In the formless void of the digital domain, with darkness over the surface of the screen, the digitizer says, "Let there be light," and there is light. Many thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you all very soon in the real world. Take care.